pull the rug from beneath the feet of the protesters, or would the protesters and those calling for reform not be taking any of it seriously?
I would imagine that they're not taking it very seriously at all. If you look at the situation in Algeria or Yemen or Jordan, you're still seeing people going out and protesting. You're still seeing people flocking to those who are trying to mobilize people to recreate something similar to what we saw in Tunisia or what we saw in Egypt recently. So I'm not convinced that lowering the price of sugar or cooking oil is going to stop Algerians from going out into the street and demanding that their government respond to their political demands, which is what I think most of these protests are really about.
Mr. Loam, what was so special about Tunisia? Why was it the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, if you look at the recent history of the Arab people, what we've seen are revolutions being used as an excuse for military coups. You have the history in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Algeria, where the military claims to introduce some sweeping change in politics by overthrowing a monarch or overthrowing another politician, and then continues to rule for decades without any accountability. What we saw in Tunisia was the opposite of that. The people rising up, a real revolution, removing a longtime dictator, and really forcing their government to respond to them. And I think a lot of people in the Arab world see that as something that's quite inspirational and something that they hope to recreate for themselves.
Well, as this conversation expands and contracts, we're going to be looking at specific countries and, of course, general trends across the region. Let's ask Anis Qatish about Syria. There was a day of rage planned for Syria, just like there was in Egypt, but nobody seems to have turned up. Why?
Yes, from following the events as somebody who has been following online activism in Syria for a long time, I found that most of the people who are calling for that day of anger were not actually based in Syria, and people in Syria did not react in a positive light to these calls. I think it was mostly opposition members outside, and opposition outside Syria has little connection with people inside the country. So especially that there were calls mostly sectarian and just political vengeance, it does not really resonate with the demands of people in Syria.
Talking about resonating with the demands of the people in Syria, what keeps Bashar al-Assad having so much popularity? Is it because a lot of his policies and official statements with regards to foreign policy are with the Arab street, are with the Syrian street, as opposed to, say, for example, a place like Egypt, where Hosni Mubarak had a peace deal with Israel, which was in no way reflective of the views of the majority of people there?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. People, even who are not fans of the regime, swear by the foreign policy of Syria. They see it as tried and proven, as it has survived many tests in facing outside pressure, especially after the assassination of Hariri in 2005.
Saaduddin Talib, as we talk about Yemen and a lot of the grievances that people have in Yemen, corruption comes up quite often, very close to the top of the lists of grievances. You were part of an anti-corruption unit in Yemen. Why did you resign?
Thank you for having me. My resignation is basically because I thought that the Anti-Corruption Commission was not doing its job. And the reason for that is quite straightforward, is that it was actually structured in a way that prevents it from doing its job. And it is important to characterize the regimes that we are talking about. For instance, Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen basically they have parallel characteristics in the regimes. And I want to expand a little bit on that because it really describes the form of rule in these three countries. It's basically these three countries were run by a regime that is a despotic regime, controlled by one person and his family, and they have the opportunity to loot, basically, the wealth of the nation. Only now we see all over the international media what is the wealth of President Mubarak, and all the media is talking about 40 to 70 billion dollars. It's the same. It was the same in Tunisia, and I think, and I'm sure it is the same as well in Yemen. This kind of corruption, where the ruler is in control of the state wealth, is basically comes down to what's called in the corruption science as state capture. These state captures, that's why I see it as quite ridiculous that these regimes are able to reform.
Okay.
Basically, reform.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you. I want to look at the relationship. I'm going to come back to you, sir. I want to look at the relationship with the most powerful nation on earth, the United States. It's quite interesting to see the U.S. reaction to all of this. Let's hear what President Obama's special envoy to Egypt, Frank Wisner, said about President Mubarak over the weekend.
The president must stay in office in order to steer those changes through. I therefore believe that President Mubarak's continued leadership is critical. It's his opportunity to write his own legacy. He's given 60 years of his life to the service of his country. This is an ideal moment for him to show the way forward.
Of course, the U.S. State Department distanced itself from those comments, saying they were Wisner's personal view, but now is Washington's confusion playing out in the region. Mr. Talib, stay where you are. All of you gentlemen, stay where you are. I want to take a phone call from Oliver in Virginia. Oliver, I understand your question or comment is along the same lines. Go ahead, Oliver.
Thank you very much. Basically, my question is the position of the U.S. from President Mubarak is really, they're not standing with him, despite all the favors that he did, especially with the removal of Saddam Hussein and the embargo for 13 years. He played a critical role in this issue. But, you know, we don't see the U.S. standing with the man at this moment. So is that a signal that they don't need him anymore? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oliver. Let's go back to Saaduddin Talib, and I want to take this and tie it into Yemen quite specifically. Oliver from Virginia is saying that the U.S. is not standing by Mubarak. I mean, I think despite Wisner's comments, there seems to be this begrudging acceptance from the United States and other powers that, yes, Mubarak must go now. I wonder, what about a place like Yemen? Are the stakes higher in Yemen, given the Houthi rebellion in the north, the secessionist movement in the south, and of course the direct U.S. interests and global interests in the fact that Al-Qaeda has camps in Yemen and that Yemen allows the United States to conduct drone attacks on Al-Qaeda camps in the country. Would the U.S. be as begrudgingly accepting if Ali Abdullah Saleh's position becomes untenable?
Definitely. I think Ali Abdullah Saleh will face exactly the same fate as was faced by President Mubarak. Ali Abdullah Saleh, I don't think, is able to withstand the amount of pressure internally and externally that was put on President Mubarak to leave. I think Ali Abdullah Saleh will be an easier issue. I think what's important to note here is that the rest of the countries that have already been tired of these regimes that have, everybody knows, the taxi driver knows, the fruit seller knows, that the people who are ruling the country have been taking its wealth. And therefore, the test here is really what happens in Egypt. If the United States does not stand with the people and which I see as unbelievable, Mr. Wisner has just indicated that Mr. Mubarak will steer the reforms. I think he will only steer it to recapture the state.
Okay.
And reintroduce the old methods again,
Okay.
just for the sake that the status quo continues. I don't think that is a feasible option for President Saleh.
Okay. Khalid Loom in Boston, looking at what comes next, what comes ahead. A lot of the fears from many Western commentators and Western leaders and policymakers is the incompatibility, as they would put it, between